Professor Hunt, can you tell us a little bit about what you do?
Of course. So I'm a cognitive neuroscientist. I'm based in the Department of Experimental Psychology in Oxford. And my group uses mostly techniques that allow us to study the brain, but with quite high temporal resolution. So we can watch neural activity unfold on a millisecond by millisecond basis. So we have a range of techniques that allow us to do that in the human brain. One of which is quite an old technique, electroencephalography. It kind of dates back to the 1920s, which directly measures electrical potential differences between one part of the scalp and another. And another which is magnetoencephalography, which measures the naturally occurring magnetic fields that are associated with those electrical currents. So when your brain is in action, as I'm talking to you now, the brain is continually generating electrical fields that are measurable out of the skull, from the scalp. And so what we're interested in doing is then trying to see if we can look at the representations that are stored within that neural data and see how they vary as a function of different cognitive tasks that you might be performing. So my particular interest is in decision making. And decision making is itself something which unfolds at quite a fast, dynamic timescale. You know, if I'm choosing between two items in the grocery store, for example, the way in which I do that is something which unfolds over a course of several seconds. But there might be several subcomponents that are occurring whilst I'm performing that evaluation. So what we're hoping to do is to use techniques like magnetoencephalography and EEG to measure the neural representations that support those processes, such as decision making. So that's the main focus of my lab's research at the moment.
Great, thank you. Okay, I see, makes sense. So both of these descriptions are true, but at different time scales.
I think so. Yeah. There's more nuance to that you could get into if you were getting deep into cellular neuroscience. But I think that broadly, like the key distinction is to do with the time scale over which you're storing and processing information. But one is therefore much more closely linked to learning and retaining information, and one is more linked to processing information.
Okay, thank you. That clears things up. One of the things that I've seen in the work that you published is the influence of social factors in decision making. I was wondering, is there some sort of metric that can tell us how much our decisions are actually influenced by what other people are deciding to do?
Not that I can think of immediately off the top of my head. So a metric of kind of direct social influence.
Or rather just qualitatively even, like how much does this influence us? How big is a factor of what other people are doing on our decisions?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly something that we can try to titrate within the lab. So we can put people into, again, these slightly artificial decision scenarios, and we can get them to play games where they might have information that's available to themselves, private information, and then they might also be given some information from social partners. And you can then look at the choices that participants make, and the fact that you know which is the private information or which is the social information, that's a way of trying to kind of titrate like the degree to which you're being influenced by your social peers. One of the interesting things which has been looked at is kind of how that changes actually over the lifespan. So it seems like in teenagers, for example, that's a period when they're particularly susceptible to wanting to go out and seek social influence and take on board the influence of other peers, and also they want to try to perform their decisions in a way that kind of impresses or influences other social agents. So it's certainly something that you kind of see a lot. You see as like a key factor, not only in what makes us human, the fact that we're a very social species, but also it's something which kind of shapes how we develop over different stages of our lives. Yeah, that's maybe a partial answer to your question.
Okay, thank you. A common buzzword that turns up in people's minds when they think about decision making is the word willpower. What actually is it, like in the context of thinking about the brain and how it works? What does willpower mean, and what does it mean for you to will yourself to change a decision that you like, to change what you were planning to do? Like they say, you need to have strong willpower to get yourself up in the morning and go jogging and to go to the gym consistently. Like, what do these things mean? How do we look at willpower in a scientific way? Is there a clear way of understanding it?
Yeah, again, so there's I guess the way that often psychologists think about it is they try to titrate it down into a slightly simplified version in the lab, which is often thinking about it effort-based decision making. So how much effort you're willing to deploy before you commit to making a choice. So you can find regions of the brain, particularly in the anterior cingulate cortex, which seem to become active when you choose to take a course of action that requires a lot of literally physical effort in order to obtain a reward. So these are experiments where you might give somebody like a forceful grip lever that they have to squeeze in order to get some money at the end of the experiment, for example. And the higher, the stronger that you have to do the contraction, the less likely people are to actually commit to taking that choice. But if you look at trials where they do decide to make that choice, then you see a lot of activity in the anterior cingulate cortex. And that's been of interest because it's actually a brain region that's also associated with hypofunction in conditions like apathy. So people who are just very unmotivated, very unwilling to get up, they kind of lose the motivation to want to even get up, get dressed in the morning. If you get them to perform similar kinds of tasks, are much less willing to invest effort in order to obtain rewards in these kinds of tasks as well. And conversely, if you go and stimulate the cingulate cortex, you actually find that suddenly people, this is more of a kind of subjective report, but there is this really striking report that in a patient stimulated with a cingulate electrode, he suddenly said, I just feel this kind of burning desire to go out and do things. I can see myself being extremely focused. So yeah, there do seem to be regions of the brain which do seem to be kind of linked to that idea of motivated, effort-based decision making. Quite how you go about training that and how you train yourself to be the kind of person who manages to go to the gym every day and ace all their exams and so on. That's maybe more of a psychological question than a neurobiological question.
I see. Okay. That's very interesting though, that you can stimulate a certain part of the brain and make people want to do things. Would it be possible to exploit that and actually build technology that can make you like want to do much more things than normal?
Maybe. It's difficult to know. I mean, so deep brain stimulation is technology which, when you first hear about it, sounds very much like science fiction. And then you realize that actually it's out there in the world working very successfully for treating certain clinical conditions. So this is where we're not quite talking about the kind of stuff that Elon Musk is doing, where he's really interested in recording populations of single neurons. We're talking about implanting an electrode that kind of acts as just like a local stimulator, a little bit like a pacemaker. People won't, this isn't typically done just like in healthy people like myself and yourself, it's not something which is offered as like a service to make yourself more focused or that kind of thing, but it is used as like a really impressive treatment for Parkinson's disease. So people who have lost dopaminergic input to a part of their brain called the striatum. So the key thing which happens in Parkinson's disease is you basically lose dopamine from your brain, and that means that you can no longer initiate actions in the way that you might have done previously alongside a set of other clinical features. So the standard treatment for that is to give a drug, L-DOPA, which boosts your dopamine levels. But if that line of treatment is unsuccessful, then the next line of treatment is to go and implant electrodes that target a part of that network called the subthalamic nucleus. And if you stimulate in that part of the brain, then literally instantaneously people are able to develop that ability to go and move. They're awakened out of their Parkinson's disease, and they can keep those electrodes implanted for tens of years, and it will last. The treatment lasts and is successful for a long time. So yeah, brain stimulation is a very real thing. Whether or not to do that to the general population, I think is a question which I think we're very far away from, and I don't think that it's something that the risks involved in neurosurgery are obviously huge, and it's not something that I think the neuroscience field is considering or taking seriously. But certainly, brain stimulation for changing people's behaviour is real and is extremely effective.
I see. So you mentioned Neuralink and Elon Musk. I was wondering, what firstly do you think about it? Like, do you think it's going to be successful in the goals that it has, such as one of the big claims that Elon Musk makes is that the technology is going to be able to make a disabled person who can't walk, like, be able to use their legs. Do you think such things are possible, or are they just marketing gimmicks? Can we actually have technology that can make a blind person see, or a person who can't use his arms start using his arms?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing which has been impressive about what Neuralink has managed to achieve at the moment is far less about the neuroscience and is far more about the engineering. So they have developed these very impressive electrode arrays that are able to be implanted under the dura, so on the surface of the brain, and be held there for quite a persistent period of time, and they can also go and record from those. But the main thing which is very impressive is the fact that they're implanting those via a robot as well. So they're using essentially robotic surgery that manages to avoid the blood vessels that you're using as you're putting the electrodes in. So I think technologically it's actually a very exciting kind of real contribution to the field. In terms of what they've managed to achieve in terms of decoding brain activity and getting people to be able to do things which they may have otherwise been incapable of, they're actually, I'd say, some way behind the rest of the field, the state of the art. So they can, they showed that kind of example of a monkey playing Pong, for example. That kind of thing of actually being able to use an implanted chip to remote control something which has a movable controller is something that we've been able to do for quite some time in neuroscience. And more the state of the art is to say, well, how do you move from simple tasks like that, which only have like one degree of freedom, to much more sophisticated tasks like being able to reach and grasp something and move it in a way that's dexterous and because movement just has a very high number of degrees of freedom. I'd say that probably the way in which that's actually going to be useful for patients isn't going to be by getting them to control their own bodies. My hunch is it's probably going to be by connecting it up to other robotic actuators, which we have more control over as experimenters. So there are very impressive demonstrations, not by Neuralink, but by other people, of being able to train a neural chip so that somebody who is completely paralyzed can literally pick up a cup of coffee and move it and drink that cup of coffee. And similarly, to be able to decode people's speech, so to be able to decode what people want to be able to say. They do it with I think about a kind of 10% word error accuracy at the moment, and about 5% was kind of like when it started to be useful for when we interacted with, say, Siri around the household. So yeah, I think we are really kind of progressing towards that state, but it's probably not going to be like directly controlling our own actuators. It's probably going to be connecting it up to robotic outputs.
Okay, how does the technology for that work? Like being able to control a robotic arm.
Mm-hmm.
How can we just like insert something in our brain and have like the brain understand how to move? Actually, no. I guess my question is vague because my understanding of this is vague.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how does it actually work?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but it's essentially a process of what they call neurofeedback, and so we can condition our neural activity to perform. So it's partly the neural activity itself will change, and partly it's our ability to decode that neural activity, to reliably train decoders will change as well. So we go and stick a chip inside the brain, and we're recording hundreds of thousands of neurons or whatever, but to begin with we don't have any sense of like what those neurons are really tuned for, right? So then the first thing we can do is we can say, okay, well, let's just record the neural activity and let's just ask, is there any structure in that neural activity? So we do what's called unsupervised learning. We might, simplest example of that is something like principal component analysis. If you're a scientist, you kind of know what's meant by that. And you say, okay, well, where are there meaningful axes that we can identify in that neural activity? And then we can say, okay, well, now I want to train you that, like, if you manage to increase your neural activity along one of these axes, which turns out to be an easier thing to do than to increase your activity in an orthogonal axis, then increasing your neural activity is going to make a bar go up on the screen, for example. And all I'm going to ask you to do is I'm just going to ask you, can you increase that bar? And if you, with enough training, you are going to be able to increase the activity in that neural subspace, and you're going to get feedback for doing that by increasing that bar. And so the way that that's working is by saying, okay, well, you are now training your brain to be able to drive the activity in that particular direction. So that's a process of internal reorganization in the way that we're constantly doing. We're constantly having to adjust our neural activity based upon errors and feedback that we're getting from interacting with the environment. And then on top of that, I imagine that they're also asking questions about, well, how do we reliably improve the decoder that we build on the neural activity so that it maximizes its discriminability of the different axes and so on. So there's lots of analysis challenges in terms of decoding the activity. But the basic idea is kind of like, you condition people, get used to the idea of being able to drive activity in certain axes, and then you build up more complex tasks from there.
That's incredible, the fact that we can do that. Do you know like what these axes are? Is this like a sort of frequency space kind of axes, or are they certain sets of neurons that are activating? Like, what do they look like?
Yeah, so they're sets of neurons basically. So the activity that you're recording is firing rates of neurons, and you would typically be recording populations of thousands of neurons at a time, and you'd say which neurons tend to be coactive with one another, and those coactive neurons are the ones which occupy different kind of axes in your environment. And I guess one of the big questions then is, like, are there lots of axes? Is it a high dimensional space that neural activity lives in, because it's very high dimensional in terms of a number of neurons, or is it quite a low dimensional subspace that you live in? And it seems like the answer to that actually might be slightly different for different brain regions. So visual cortex, it seems like the evidence is that it needs to be high dimensional to be able to represent the vast array of different features that are out there in the environment. Whereas motor cortex, because you're ultimately interested in controlling something with a relatively constrained degrees of freedom and so on, that's probably, I'd say that the evidence is pointing towards it being lower dimensional, but it's still very much open and up for grabs, that question.
Okay, great. One question that I think is quite relevant to many people is what happens